The Strangler Vine is a mystery thriller, I suppose you'd call it, and it's set in India in 1837, which is 20 years before the Indian Mutiny happened. And it's a sort of, in a way, it's a kind of shaggy dog story. It's about two rather mismatched men who are sent off to find this character called Xavier Mountstuart, who is a sort of poet-adventurer type of a Byronic sort who has gone missing. He's the most famous man in India. He's a bit of a handful. You know, women adore him, men want to be him, but he's, misbehaves. And he's disappeared. And the East India Company, which rules India at the time, wants to find him. They basically want to bundle him off home before he does anything more scandalous. And so these men have to go off and find him. And they have to go into the heartland of India, which is where a famous group of roadside bandits, the thugs, have become very well known. The thug, in fact, the word thug comes into the English language through the word thuggy. These people actually existed. They were robbers who befriended people on the roads, would travel with them for a few days, and then, one evening they'd all be sitting around the fire and the campfire would be blazing and they'd be singing songs, and then one of the thugs would say, can I have a light or something? And then all the thugs end up standing behind the poor old victims and they strangle them immediately, and they are killed, and they become very adept at this apparently, and then they chuck them in a grave that they've prepared earlier, steal all their stuff, and off they go. And crushing the thugs became a sort of big thing that the East India Company sort of wanted to do in order almost to sort of justify their rule of India, to show that they brought order to India, that they were a civilizing influence. And it became a kind of big, kind of Gothic story in Britain as well. So all these sort of bits come to play in this sort of story of these men trying to find the guy who's gone off to look for the thugs. My book is very much a sort of genre piece, and I as you say, I had written long non-fiction books before that. I do have a kind of very basic kind of love of history, just knowing stuff. And one of the reasons I was interested in writing sort of crime thrillers, detective novels, that sort of thing, which I've been reading all my life, was because often the best ones give you a place. If you think about somebody like John Harvey gives you Nottingham, or C.J. Sansom gives you sort of the Henrician court, and it's something I felt I could really do. And I had been reading about this period in India, and this rather fascinating period where you have this sort of mythical, the idea of these mythical, nasty, brutish bandits who the British claimed were worshippers of Kali, and they murdered, as a sort of tribute to the goddess, which makes it even more kind of horrible and dark. It very much sort of fits in with that period when Europe sort of looks at the Orient and thinks it's sort of mysterious and scary and fascinating and very scary, and also, is a very good justification for going in and being imperialists and colonialists. So that had been kind of rolling around in my head for years, that story of the thugs and the British guy, a guy called William Sleeman, who was set the job of basically crushing them, and he did an incredibly good job. Used lots of techniques that later went into modern policing, but he was also very ruthless. And I thought, I want to do something about that. And I've got this. I've had this detective rolling around in my head for years, and I wanted him. The idea is he's a sort of working class, what they call a private inquiry agent. And he's a sort of self-taught autodidact. Where does he come from? How does he get into, how does he become this person? And I thought, I'm going to start him in India. And so I sort of yoked these two things together and ended up with this book, this idea. It took me 15 years to write 2 books. I mean, I had 2 babies in that time as well, so it wasn't too shaming. These books were taking sort of 6 years at a time. And after I'd done the second one, which was a book called The Three Emperors, about about the Kaiser and the last Tsar and George V before the First World War, I really felt quite used up. I just thought, I'm not ready to do another book quite like that now. I really wanted to do something else, and I'd never written something quickly. I'd always been rather scared of the idea of plot, to be perfectly honest, but I did have this thing rolling around in my head, this detective, and I'd been reading and reading about India, about the beginning of Victoria's reign, because this book is set in 1837, which is the year Victoria comes to the throne, and it's also the year that Dickens started publishing Pickwick Papers as a serial. So I was just very interested in this period. I think it's a fascinating decade, actually, this 10 years after Victoria comes to the throne, because at the beginning, everybody's going around on horses. By the end, you've got iron and railways and telegraph and people writing about how the world is moving too fast. There's a great feeling. It was a tremendous decade of innovation and change and social change. And I like the idea of my character because I'm writing 3 of them, moving through this period, but starting off in this place where change is coming at the same time. It's the time in India where previously, Europeans had come out into marriage with the local Indians and very much kind of got involved with Indian culture. And then what happened, which is often what happens in these situations, Western women started coming out, wanting to marry the Westerners. And what happens is there's a sort of separation, a sort of apartheid starts creeping in, and the colonialists find reasons for looking down on the occupied, and it just felt a real world that I was very keen to kind of play with. And the more history I read, the more kind of plot ideas and little tricks and stories and things I felt I could put in it, and it got until I sort of ended up just sort of going for it. Plot, incredibly difficult. I'm married to a writer, and I had to keep going to him saying, I'm here and they've got to get there, and how am I going to do this? So after my big non-fiction books, I used to go, God, I hate it, I can't ever do it again. But you know what? Making stuff up is so great. I just sit down. I've never been a fast writer, but I would sit down and I'd say, I've got to do my 1,000 words a day. I mean, I've never been able to do that before, and I just, got it down. It was often rubbish because I usually write about 3 drafts, but as long as you've got something down, you've got something to work with. And it was such a pleasure, just sort of sitting down and saying, right, I'm going to put him here, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. And, often wasn't very good, so you have to keep working on it. But actually the process was, I felt I sort of cleaned out my tubes, having spent kind of 15, 20 years writing these other non-fiction books where, every sentence you have to check, that what you're saying is true, and it's incredibly slow, and sometimes you're just incredibly frustrated and feel sort of blocked up. But this was, it was like a kind of lovely little kind of foxtrot by comparison, or something like that, anyway.